Hello, I'm Michael Wunsch. I'm the plant pathologist at the North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. In this video, I'm going to share with you our most recent results from our fungicide application timing and efficacy evaluations for the management of powdery mildew in field peas. Fungicides are very effective tools for managing powdery mildew in field peas when the appropriate product is applied at the appropriate timing. And with a single application of the most effective fungicide at an appropriate growth stage, you can get season-long control. But that's dependent on applying the appropriate product at the right growth stage. Applying the wrong product at the right growth stage will not give you season-long control, and applying the right product at the wrong growth stage will not give you season-long control. Okay, testing was conducted on both yellow and green peas. Standard seeding rate and row spacing, 15 gallon acre spray volume in this case. I don't think that's the most critical, but that is what we utilized. These are applications with a handheld spray boom. We use fine droplets throughout. In this case, you're trying to optimize coverage to particularly the upper part of the canopy, and fine droplets do an excellent job of that. And in the fungicide efficacy studies, we applied at full bloom and the first pod's full length and flat to partially or fully filled. When the pods were fully filled, up to one pod per plant was fully filled. Okay, up to one plant per pod fully filled. Okay, so this is in the very early end of pod fill. Powdery mildew rarely develops until a little bit later in pod development, and sometimes doesn't develop until the end of the season. And our goal in this testing is to achieve satisfactory management of powdery mildew season long with a single application made early in pod fill before powdery mildew typically develops. Okay, disease development in these studies was completely due to natural infection. No pathogen inoculum or residues or anything were applied. Just whenever the disease showed up naturally. We did plant on the later side to facilitate basically higher risk of powdery mildew. Because late planting in the second half of May increases risk of powdery mildew. And powdery mildew assessment is simply a visual assessment of the percent of the canopy exhibiting symptoms of the disease, which is very simple to do with powdery. Detailed methods are presented in this table. This would suggest that you either pause the recording to look at this in detail if you're interested in that, or you look at the corresponding PDF that doesn't have the audio, and you can look at it in detail. But this shows the number of experimental replicants. It shows the exact nozzles and pressures utilized, the planting date, the harvest date, and all that. The number of varieties and which varieties we assessed. Okay, and so let's go to fungicide application timing first. In this case, we applied a single application of Proline at 5.7 fluid ounces and looked to see what that single application would do for us for season-long control. Okay, you see a non-treated control. You can see that we did testing on 4 different field pea varieties. Arcadia and Empire are green peas. Navarro and Salamanca are yellow peas. Okay, right away you can see we got a fair amount of disease at the end of the season. Okay, now disease in this case came in very, very late. As I mentioned in the corresponding video, when disease comes in very, very late, it still creates the powdery mildew dust problems at harvest. It can still cause the problems with getting your desiccant herbicide to work properly. However, it doesn't cause much of an impact on yield at that point. In this case, the powdery mildew came in when 95% or more of our pods were fully filled. And so yield potential was set. So I'm only going to present disease data for this study because the yield data were completely uninformative. The yields were same all the way across the board. And that's what you expect with a very late onset with powdery mildew. If disease comes on early with powdery mildew, you can get yield losses of 50% easily. Okay, so in this case, just like always, we don't know exactly when the powdery mildew wants to show up. We want to spray a single application of fungicide and give ourselves season-long control so that we don't have to worry about powdery mildew. And we don't have to worry about it whether it shows up in early pod fill, mid pod fill, or right before harvest. Okay, so we applied at early bloom, that'd be 43 to 93% of plants in bloom. What you can see is a single application at that time gave us approximately 50 to 65% disease control. Okay, so a single application at that time protected about half to 2/3 of our canopy through the end of pod fill. As we delayed the application by a couple days to where we had 68 to 100% of plants in bloom. Okay, so we're still at very early bloom, but now we're at the point where the vast majority of the plants are in bloom. Okay, you can still see that we are still having problems with our season-long powdery mildew management. Okay, it's a little bit better on average than the earlier application, but still not good enough. As we moved into very initial pod development with 20 to 60% of plants with full-length pod, you can see that on average, even though there's not statistical separation, you can see on average you're getting better disease management season long, but still not 100%. Okay, as you move to 90 to 100% of plants with full-length pod, now we're starting to get into the territory of really having some decent disease management season long. And then when we got to the plant point where on average 1 pod per plant was fully filled and we applied at that growth stage, we had 100% disease control at the end of the season. 100%. And that's really remarkable because disease did not show up until the latter part of the second week of August. And that application was made July 23rd or July 27th, depending on the variety. So what that means is that we achieved 100% disease control to the end of the season, even though disease didn't show up for 2 to 2.5 weeks after that application. Gave us excellent residual management, residual activity. Okay, you can see in this case, waiting until 2 to 4 pods per plant were fully filled. Also, you realize that's a little risky because sometimes the powdery mildew shows up about that stage. And even 1 pod per plant fully filled, sometimes if you plant really late and you're in a high-risk geography for powdery, sometimes you can see it show up about then. So what these results suggest is that you want to be spraying that fungicide as those first pods are reaching, have become fully filled. The very first pods you see out in that canopy, when you see just a few of those pods fully filled out in that canopy, that's when you want to spray for powdery mildew. And look what happened when we waited until initial appearance of disease to spray. And mind you, this was not the level of disease that you would see from your pickup. This was, the type of level of disease that I would detect. I would say 2-3% of the canopy diseased. Okay, you see that we did not get 100% disease control anymore. And of course you aren't. You do not get the ability to cure an existing infection. And so the disease that already existed out there at the time of application is not going to be eliminated. And any disease that has already established itself but has not yet manifested itself. So the pathogen spores will germinate on a leaf, penetrate and grow within the plant, and it'll take some days before they actually show outward disease symptoms. Well, those infections that are a microscopic level you won't control. So again, you need to apply this preventatively, but you can't be too early. So let's explain what we just learned. There's a penalty to applying the fungicide too late. Okay, the fungicides must be made prior to pathogen infection. And this is, when you actually see disease out there, well, there's actually more disease than you see. Because the pathogen, like I just explained, the spore will germinate on that leaf and penetrate and grow in that plant for a series of days before the outward disease symptoms manifest. In the very best of our modern fungicides, you can get some degree of curative eradication of existing infections, but that's only within 24 hours of pathogen infection. And these are microscopic level infections that you can't see with your eyes yet. and only some of these modern fungicides offer that. All of the modern fungicides perform best when applied prior to pathogen infection, even those that have some curative activity. But any infection that's beyond 24 hours, you can't manage with a fungicide, period. Okay, no matter which fungicide you're using. And that's before you can actually see the symptoms with your eyes. So if you see 2 to 3% of the canopy diseased, well, the reality is you probably have 10, 15% of the canopy diseased. It's just you can't see it yet because it hasn't manifested itself, and you aren't going to be able to control it with a fungicide. So you need to put on the fungicide before pathogen infection. And that's why there's a penalty to applying too late. Well, what about the penalty of applying too early? Notice that when we applied our early bloom, yeah, we were well before pathogen infection, but we had a penalty. The penalty didn't go away until we got to, on average, about 1 pod per plant fully filled. Okay? And the reason why there's a penalty to applying too early is because the amount of fungicide deposited in that growing tip of that plant is very minimal. And as that growing tip expands into new tissue, the amount of fungicide that's distributed into that new tissue is not enough to confer disease management. And the result is that the new growth is not protected by the fungicide. And let me illustrate that. Here is a picture of field peas sprayed with Proline, actually, at early bloom. And just like we saw in our data slide, okay? Where you can see this is shortly before crop senescence, when we're at about 90% of the pods fully filled. Okay, and what you can see is that lower canopy is whistle clean. But what about the upper canopy? It's totally white. And that's because at early bloom, that field pea is still putting on lots of new growth above that. And that new growth is going to be unprotected. So what our research results indicate is that you don't want to spray for powdery mildew at early bloom. You really want to wait until your first pods are full length to partially or fully filled. Now, you don't want to wait too long because you've got to get the fungicide on before the disease hits. And this disease is explosive and can grow very quickly. So when you see the very first pods that are fully filled, that's when you should spray. That's what our results indicate. What should you spray? That testing was done with Proline. Well, now let's look at efficacy testing results from the exact same year. Again, the disease hit so late in crop development that we did not see a yield impact from the fungicide. But what do you see here? See that Proline at 5.7 fluid ounces? Well, it's giving us about 4% disease severity at the end of the season, which corresponds perfectly to our fungicide application timing results, because these applications were made just a bit earlier. They were made when the first pods were full length and flat to partially filled across these 4 varieties, depending on the variety. Okay, so again, that's exactly what we saw in the other data set on the timing results, where the powdery mildew control was about 95% or so when we sprayed with Proline at that growth stage. But notice when we sprayed at that early growth stage with Delero, now we had 100% disease control. So it looks like Delero can give you some more flexibility to apply just a little bit earlier. Okay, when you have the first pods, you go out to that canopy, you see your very first pods are full length and just partially filled. That would be the timing here on average across these 4 varieties. And Delero gave us 100% control at that stage. And that stage is actually better for Ascochyta management if you're trying to manage both diseases with one spray. Now look at the differences among these registered products. I mean, look at Quadris, or Azoxystar, which is the generic Quadris that we applied. Look at Sulfur. Look at Headline. These products are not nearly as effective. Okay, and traditionally we've recommended these products, not knowing that the efficacy difference was so extraordinary. Now, it is possible that if you were to spray shortly before the disease showed up, maybe these other products would work better. But again, you must apply this fungicide before the disease develops. It must be applied preventatively. And so really you want a fungicide that you can apply very early in pod development, i.e. as your very first pods are filling out, and give you season-long control. Because at that growth stage, you're going to be ahead of the powdery mildew, and you want to have season-long control with a single application. And this testing was conducted in that manner. And so the fungicides here that perform well are the ones that perform well with a single application program applied at that growth stage. Let's look at testing from 2024. In 2024, we see the exact same products performing the best. Application timing was equivalent, where we applied at that first pod full length and flat a little bit earlier, or partially filled. Okay, so application timing was broadly equivalent, but a hair earlier. Okay, and what you can see is that the Delero gave you nearly 100% control. Proline was not quite as good, but again, really similar to what we saw in the previous study. You're getting very good disease control. Okay, there's clearly a rate response with a higher rate of Delero performing better than a lower rate, and a higher rate of Proline performing better than a lower rate, but those differences are small. Again, look at how the Azoxystar, which is the generic Quadris, and the headliner are performing. They are not very good, nor is Priaxor. Now, in 2024, we actually had informative yield data. And these yield data, in this case, were driven not only by powdery mildew, though, but also by Ascochyta blight. So 2024 was actually a very rainy year, a very wet year in Carrington. And these are not the type of conditions we typically associate with powdery mildew. And they were highly favorable for Ascochyta because it was cool and wet during bloom. Okay, but again, we did plant our peas late, which is high risk for powdery, and so even on those wet years, you can get powdery. But these yield data are driven by both Ascochyta management and powdery mildew management. And normally, if we're going peas, we want to do a single fungicide application that gives us management of both of these. What you can see is that this application timing, which was, again, the first pods flat to partially filled, full bloom, first pods flat to partially filled. At this application timing, we got very good management of both diseases, as seen by the yield response with that Delero and that Proline. And this parallels our efficacy testing for Ascochyta blight in field peas. These two fungicides are excellent against powdery mildew in field peas. One thing that you will see from these results is that we do get pretty good activity from some of these other fungicides when Ascochyta is a major driver. Okay, but in our case, we're worried about powdery mildew. What you want to look at is those fungicides that are delivering both excellent powdery mildew management and high yields. Okay, because those yields were driven partially by that powdery mildew, and of course the powdery mildew management is what we're chasing. So let's take a moment to review what we have learned. We optimized powdery mildew management with a single fungicide application when it was applied when peas were in full bloom and an average of 1 pod per plant fully filled. We were able to apply a bit earlier with Delero and get 100% disease control. We were able to apply with a single application Delero and get 100% disease control with an application made at the first pods full length and partially filled. Now, these results were from a single study, but results were consistent across 4 field pea varieties that reached this growth stage on different dates. If you go back to the timing study results, you'll see that the application timings corresponding to those growth stages actually differed across varieties, and that's indicated in that slide. Now, so the fact that we saw the same results across varieties, irrespective of the date that we sprayed, and all contingent on growth stage, strongly suggests that these are replicable results. But yet, these are timing results from a single year. And they are preliminary results because of that. Okay, this is an ongoing project. We're going to be testing again in 2025. And at the end of the 2025 field season, I'll give you an update. But right now, these are the recommendations that have been developed based on our preliminary results thus far. We also saw very sharp differences in the efficacy of the fungicides for management of powdery mildew in field peas, with Delero and Proline performing the best, and a rate response observed for both. So Delero at 12 fluid ounces performed better than 10 ounces, and Proline at 5.7 fluid ounces performed better than 5 ounces. Now, applied as a single application at very early pod development, these products gave us protection to the end of the season. None of the other registered products did that. The other registered products may perform better applied shortly before disease development. But again, with powdery mildew, we need to get the fungicide on before the disease develops, and we don't know if the disease will develop at early, mid, or late pod fill. These fungicides gave us the flexibility to make a single application at an early growth stage that almost always precedes powdery mildew development and give us protection to the end of the season. Now, that said, most producers in the wetter production regions who are spraying for powdery mildew, this would be western Minnesota, eastern North Dakota, they are also interested in Ascochyta management. Waiting until the first pod is full length and fully filled is a bit late for Ascochyta management. We like to get that fungicide on closer to first pod full length and flat for Ascochyta. And so if you're interested in targeting both powdery mildew and Ascochyta blight, what these results would suggest is that your best strategy is to apply Delero when the first pods are full length and partially filled. With Delero applied at that time, it can give you season-long protection to the end of the season with a single application of powdery mildew, and it should still deliver very good Ascochyta management, as illustrated by the yield data from our 2024 study, where we had significant Ascochyta pressure in addition to the powdery mildew. Those yield data parallel the efficacy testing results we have conducted over the years, where both Proline and Delero performed very well against Ascochyta and field peas. Again, I would stress that all the recommendations shared in this presentation are preliminary recommendations based on ongoing research. I will share an update after the 2025 season. That said, you can see the efficacy testing results were consistent across varieties and across study years. And you can see that our fungicide application timing results were consistent across varieties for the optimal growth stage, irrespective of the application day. And so these results are internally consistent. With more testing across more years, however, we'll have much greater confidence in the replicability of these results. With that, I would like to thank my staff, Jesse Hafner, Aaron Faust, Gabby Henson-Swankalis, and our seasonal staff. It's the extraordinary dedication of these individuals and their hard work that make this work possible. These individuals work very long hours, and they're very dedicated. I'd like to also thank the North Dakota Crop Protection Product Harmonization and Registration Board and the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. These two programs are administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture. These two funding agencies have funded this research up to this date, or funding it going forward, in conjunction with the North Dakota State Board for Agricultural Research and Education. It is the funding from these three funding sources that allowed us to pay the staff doing the work and to also pay for the supplies and other costs associated with executing this work. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope this information is of value to your operations.